Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Chapter 8 of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan is titled Of the Virtues Commonly Called Intellectual and Their Contrary Defects. And the defects are going to be found in this long discussion of different kinds of madness, which perhaps we can put off for a while and just concentrate on what he means by intellectual virtue and what that has to do with what he calls wit. So Hobbes says virtue generally is somewhat that is valued for eminence and consisteth in comparison, right? So what does that mean? We're saying that virtue, and we use that term, we're saying this is something good, it's something that excels, right? Eminence, and it excels by comparison with other people who may not show quite so high a level. So we could talk about physical virtue, for example, when a human being excels in sports, right, or weightlifting or something like that. We could also talk about moral virtue. One person is better than another. And then we can talk about intellectual virtue. How does a person use their mind? Are they better at it than other people? And so this goes all the way back to ancient philosophy, and it's a term that would be very familiar to those in Hobbes' own time. And we can think about, what is it to have a good mind in our own contemporary language? So Hobbes is going to talk about this primarily in terms of a good wit, and he says that the same word wit can be used also to distinguish one certain ability from the rest. And then he's going to talk about these virtues, intellectual virtues, are of two sorts, natural and acquired. And he's going to talk about acquired a little bit later in the chapter, but we should probably take a look at that first so that we can, you might say, get that out of the way. So he says, as for acquired wit, what does that actually mean? It is acquired by method and instruction. He says there's no such thing as this other than reason, which is grounded on the right use of speech and produces the sciences. And then he refers back to a previous chapter. I've already talked about reason and science, so I don't need to go into that now. So he is here really concentrating on what he calls natural wit. Now, what does that mean? He wants to clarify for us right at the start that natural doesn't mean something that is like born in us. He says not what a person has from their birth. That's nothing other than sense, wherein human beings differ so little from one another and from brute beasts. Let's not call that a virtue. So what does he mean then? The natural wit is gotten by use only and experience. So we exist within the world. We observe things. We make connections. We note patterns. That is going to be wit. And it happens, as he says, without any method or culture or instruction. And so, we've got a very strong distinction. If there is method and instruction, now we've got acquired wit. We're relying on somebody else to explain things to us. Natural wit, we're kind of making connections on our own, or perhaps in discussion with other people who are also trying to figure things out. And what does natural wit, he says, actually consist in? Well, primarily two things. One of them is, he calls it celerity of imagining. So that's swiftness, or the capacity to imagine very readily, very easily. And then the second part of it is a steady direction to an end, actually following through, making sure that we stay on course. And so he says that's what makes for a good wit. On the contrary, a slow imagination, somebody who can't see the connections between things, makes the defect or fault of the mind that we sometimes call dullness or stupidity, right? They don't get things. And this is going to depend, he says, on the difference of human passions, love, dislike, some one thing, some another. And so, we're drawn in different directions in our thoughts, right? Then he's going to talk about two different, we could say, objects of what it is that we grasp, what it is that we take note of. And interestingly, we've got similitudes, how things are similar to each other, what we would call their connections, right? So observing similitudes leads us to what he calls a good fancy. Now, fancy is a word that he said earlier, basically just means imagination. He says that it comes from Greek. It does indeed come from Greek. Fantasia means the things that we have as like appearances or impressions, but also the faculty of imagination. So, we do have the capacity to note similarities between things, but observing differences and dissimilitudes, how things are distinct from each other, that is going to be good judgment, which can also be called discretion. And he says that we do that because we discern and judge between one thing or another. And when this is not easy, we say that a person actually has good judgment. And, for example, in conversation and business, when times, places, and persons are to be discerned, we call this discretion. And then he's going to say something very interesting. So the former, that is fancy, without the help of judgment, is not commended, not praised as a virtue. But the latter, which is judgment and discretion, is commended for itself without the help of fancy. We value one of them more than the other. Later on in the work, he's actually going to say, judgment without fancy is wit, but fancy without judgment is not. So fancy could actually go off on its own without the needed adjunct of judgment or discretion, and it may not actually be helpful. And this is where a lot of the kinds of madness come in, which we'll talk about elsewhere. So here he's going to bring up a number of different kinds of discourse, and he wants to, notice what he's doing here. He's exercising judgment, not fancy, in talking about whether they rely primarily on fancy or judgment. So, poetry, whether it epic or dramatic, and in sonnets, epigrams, and other pieces. What do you need? Well, you do need some judgment, but you really need fancy more because they please for the extravagancy, but ought not to displease by indiscretion. Okay, so maybe that would also extend to love songs and stuff like that, which are a certain kind of poem set to music. What about history? Do we want people to be primarily focused on imagination or fancy in history? Not really. We want them to be focusing on judgment or discretion instead. Judgment must be eminent. Fancy, he says, has no place but only in adorning the style, just to make it seem rhetorically nice, you could say. Orations of praise and invective, so saying good things about somebody, criticizing somebody. The fancy is predominant because the design is not truth but to honor or dishonor, which is done by noble or vile comparisons. The judgment does not suggest what circumstances make an action laudable or culpable. And then he talks about hortatives and pleading. So hortative means urging somebody to do something. As truth or disguise serveth best to the design in hand, so is judgment or fancy most required. Okay, so that could be half and half. What about demonstration or counsel? The demonstration, the kind of thing that will lead to science. Counsel, giving somebody good advice. And he says, all other rigorous search of truth. Judgment is doing everything, except sometimes the understanding needs to be opened by some aptsolitude, so there is some use of fancy there. But let's get rid of metaphors, he says. Metaphors are going to screw us up. Hobbes is kind of allergic to the use of metaphor, even though he does use metaphors in his work, doesn't he? So these different types of discourse are using these, we could call them dimensions of human capacity to note similarities or differences in different ways. And then he's going to come back to the topic of prudence once again, and he's going to tell us when the thoughts of a person that has a design in view, some purpose, some goal, running over a multitude of things, observes how they conduce to that design or what design they may conduce to, if the observations be such as are not easy or usual, this wit is called prudence. So prudence is not something radically different than wit. It's a kind of wit, and it's exercised in matters that most people have trouble with, right? They're not used to doing it, or it's difficult to do, and it relies on accumulating experience. And here Hobbes is going to say something very interesting. He tells us, there's not so much difference of human beings as there is in their fancies and judgments. Why? Because the experience of human beings equal in age is not much unequal as to the quantity, but it lies in different occasions, each having their private design. So governing a family well and governing a kingdom well are not different degrees of prudence, but different sorts of business. So, some of us might be particularly prudent when it comes to understanding musical composition because we've been spending a lot of time listening to music and playing music, practicing, learning an instrument, learning how to compose. Others might not be very good at that, but they are good at running a household, in budgeting, and figuring out how to take the money that you make each month and set some aside, and how to, maximize the purchasing power. And that's because they do that, right? If you don't have experience in something, you're probably not going to be able to have any prudence in that matter. The last thing that he's going to talk about before his long discussion of madness is the cause of difference of wits. Why do some of us have more ability and some have less ability? And he says, it really has to do with what is driving us, our passions. And the difference of passions proceed partly from different constitution of the body. We have our, bodily composition, which may steer us in one direction or another, but also from different, as he says, education. So, what do we learn? What do we hear? What messages are we getting from our society, from our friends and family, from other people, perhaps even books, right? And he's going to talk about one set of passions in particular as being really good for leading a person to develop judgment or discretion. He says the passions that most of all cause the differences of wit are principally the more or less desire of power, of riches, of knowledge, and of honor. And then he says something kind of peculiar, which is going to be explained more in a later chapter. All of these can be reduced to the first, the desire of power. Why? Because riches, knowledge, and honor are but several sorts of power. So if we're not desiring power, we're really not going to develop our wit. But fortunately, we all desire power in some way or another, so we develop some measure of wit. And he says that, when we want things, then we start exercising our judgment. And he says the thoughts are to the desires as scouts and spies to range abroad and find the way to the things desired. So steadiness of the mind's motion, quickness of the same, proceed from that. And he says to have no desire is to be dead. To have weak passions is dullness. And to have passions indifferently for everything, giddiness and distraction. To have stronger and more vehement passions for any one thing that is ordinarily seen in others, that's what is called madness, and we want to avoid that. So instead, what we want is, intelligent, we could say intelligently oriented passions for power, and that will lead us to developing our natural wit, which is, again, intellectual virtue of a certain sense, which could very well, and Hobbes thinks that this is important, be supplemented by acquired wit. If we have the opportunity to study and to learn, why wouldn't we do that, right? And we can put the two of those together and have yet a better mind. But natural wit precedes acquired wit for Hobbes, and we want to be attentive to why it is that judgment and discretion is going to be more important than what he's calling fancy.